I'd like to thank the speakers for having me here today. I think it's a very exciting conference, and I'm happy to be a part of it. I've been tasked with providing an overview of the future of medical cannabis and some of the challenges that we need to overcome to destigmatize medical cannabis use and bring it into the mainstream, and what the role of clinical research might play in doing this. Medical cannabis has been legal in California for about 20 years, but it still remains on the fringe of medical care. And in order to move the field forward, I think it's important for us now to start talking about these different categories of medical cannabis use so that we can use precise language going forward. This in no way denigrates any of the categories of use that there are and that I'll describe, but the distinctions really come from a need to be able to interact with and speak a medical language with the medical community. The two types of medical cannabis use that I see today are therapeutic and pharmaceutical. And it's my hope that by distinguishing these two types, we can actually move policy forward at a faster pace, because we'll be able to change perceptions and destigmatize medical cannabis use. In the therapeutic category, I would put symptoms that have a fairly subjective and quick readout for patients. So if a pain patient wants to treat pain, that pain patient can right now, go into a dispensary and find a product. So that patient can now access various types of products in dispensaries and can assess for him or herself quite quickly whether these products work. It's not ideal, the situation that we have now, because patients have to go and try different preparations, they have to try different doses, and they have to assess for themselves whether the benefits are worth the side effects profile of the study drug. The same might be said for someone suffering from insomnia. So just like a patient might try melatonin as a sleep aid, this patient might try a medical cannabis preparation as a sleep aid. And again, the patient has the ability and the cognitive ability to assess for herself whether a medical cannabis preparation helps her sleep and how it makes her feel the next day and if it's worth it. But this is a very different category and what we also know about this category is that in healthy adults, cannabis use has been shown to be extremely safe. It has a very strong safety profile and benign side effects profile. So generally, the advantage of using medical cannabis products in this category, the upsides are fairly high and the risks are fairly low. But when you go into what I'm calling the pharmaceutical category, and again, this is, just like Mike said, if you have comments on these two categories, we'd love to hear them, because I am refining these categories as I speak to doctors and physicians worldwide, trying to come up with a system that would distinguish these two without in any way lessening the importance of each of them. But in the pharmaceutical category, I would put diseases that have a readout that come over the longer term. So in the case of glioblastoma, we have really solid evidence that cannabinoids, in combination with first-line treatment, which is called temozolomide, might shrink the growth of this very aggressive form of brain cancer and possibly even halt its growth. So in a case like glioblastoma, patients don't have the luxury of trying different products to figure out which ones will work in the end, because they don't have the time. The survival time for patients with glioblastoma is usually months. Similarly, with metabolic syndrome is a condition of symptoms that together can lead to heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and stroke. And similarly, these patients don't have an immediate readout of how medical cannabis products are affecting the course of their disease. And so, again, we need a higher level of evidence in order to understand how cannabinoids might benefit these patients. So what are the practical implications of these two categories that I've laid out? In the therapeutic category, I think medical cannabis use lends itself well to self-titration. So there are two reasons for this. Cannabis has a very large therapeutic window, and it's far removed from its toxic dose. This is unlike other pharmaceutical drug products where the therapeutic window is quite narrow and close to the toxic dose. So there's not a lot of room to play with dosing for traditional pharmaceutical products. Whereas with cannabis, you can. And the other advantage that we have with cannabis, or the other property that cannabis has that lends itself well to self-titration, is that each individual responds differently. And so a dose that might really be not tolerable to patient Y is actually very well tolerated in patient X. And so that leaves a lot of wiggle room for each patient to decide what of the best therapeutic dose is, and weighing that against what the most tolerable side effects dose is, in finding a preparation that works to control their symptoms. These patients dealing with pain, nausea, vomiting, they also have the luxury of being able to go into a dispensary and over months sometimes of trial and error find products that will benefit their symptoms. This is not an ideal situation and something I'll go back to in a little bit, but it's possible right now, and it actually improves their quality of life significantly to be able to have this option, and they use this option. And again, chemical composition variance is acceptable in this category because level of intake can ameliorate any chemical composition variance that they find in their products. When you go over to the pharmaceutical category, when you think about shrinking a brain tumor and the short time that these patients have to live, the short time that they have to affect the growth of their brain tumor, it's really important to know what the efficacious dose is that they should be taking. So, in parallel with knowing the efficacious dose, you really have to know what the active ingredients are. So we know that whole flower cannabis contains hundreds of active ingredients. What are the active ingredients that actually lead to tumor shrinkage? And once we know the active ingredients, we can make a medicine. We can do clinical work to find out which dose of this active ingredient actually has the highest likelihood of shrinking a tumor, and then use that on the patient. But in order to get to that point, we really need rigorous clinical research. In this category, I would also put risk of adverse events. So in the example I gave earlier of metabolic syndrome, a lot of these patients are at risk for heart disease and heart failure. And we know that THC can induce tachycardia. Tachycardia is a really rapid heart rate. And when we're giving a new investigational drug to a patient population that is in any way at risk with heart disease, we need to understand how a compound that increases heart rate so much will affect their heart function. So when we go back to look at these categories that I've put up here and think more deeply about them, we can kind of understand, and this actually speaks to Mike Barnes's presentation on the overall data supporting efficacy for certain indications. But the level of evidence required for mainstreaming medical cannabis use for these two different categories is different, and we can acknowledge that they're different. Here's a graph I put up from a paper that was published by Bradford and Bradford in a journal that's dedicated to health policies. And what they showed is that on the y-axis, you see all the different indications that they studied. And I'm sorry if you're having a hard time reading them, but it says anxiety, depression, glaucoma, nausea, pain, psychosis, seizures, sleep disorders, and spasticity. And on the x-axis, you see change in daily doses filled annually per physician. So they looked at prescription changes in legal medical cannabis states in the US. And they found that per year, and the largest change was for pain, per year, 1,826 daily doses of pain prescriptions were filled less. So that means that's a large number, right? And that means that patients are choosing to use medical cannabis over prescription pain medication. And it indicates two things to me. One, that medical cannabis can in fact reduce our pain prescription use, which is really important. It's a huge issue for us in the United States. But it also means that these patients are seeing some benefit to using medical cannabis over their prescription pain medications. And that's a really important fact to take into consideration. But when we go back to the medical pharmaceutical category, we have to think about generating more clinical data. And generating clinical data is a difficult proposition to do, especially when the study drug is already available to the patient population in many jurisdictions. But what clinical research gives you is this general set of information that any doctor would need to prescribe any new medication. And while we acknowledge that cannabis and cannabinoid products are not novel chemical entities, right? We don't have to go back to animal toxicity data in order to move clinical research forward. We do still lack a lot of information on how to treat patients with these products. And so when I talk to physicians around the world about medical cannabis, there are always one set of physicians who really want to help patients. They understand that medical cannabis can improve patient quality of life, and they would like to help, but they say they don't know how to help. They don't have the data that they need in order to confidently prescribe medical cannabis. That's one problem. And the second problem I'll bring up in a little bit. But this is the basic set of data any physician needs in order to prescribe a medicine confidently. And it provides information on safe dose and titration schedule, the efficacious dose. So it could be that THC and CBD shrink the glioblastoma tumor, but if we use it at a dose that's 10 times less effective, we'll never find out, right? So these studies give us that information. We need to know what the basic safety profile is in a given patient population. And I gave the example earlier of someone with heart disease taking in THC. We need to know what the side effects are. Drug-drug interactions are extremely important because we already know that cannabinoids affect liver enzymes and can affect the metabolism of other drugs that patients are taking. So we need to know how they affect those drugs. And then, of course, we need to track adverse events. So just to give you a really quick overview of what I mean by clinical research, there are different phases to clinical research, and I think we can all agree that we're past the preclinical animal toxicity stage. Anytime a new formulation is developed, the phase 1 gives you pharmacokinetic data. This is data that provides information on how a drug is absorbed in the body, how it's distributed in the body, how it's metabolized, and then how it's excreted. And this information is really important when you're considering using drugs because it tells you how long you have therapeutic levels in your blood. So a drug that's taken up and excreted very quickly might require multiple dosing a day. A drug that's taken up and stays in the plasma over the long term might only require 1 dose a day. So very important data comes from phase 1 trials. Phase 2, you get safety, dosing, and tolerability data. So in phase 2, you're already going into your sick patient population, and you're testing whether your investigational drug product is tolerable in that patient population. And again, if I use the patient population of metabolic syndrome, you have certain patients who will have some kind of heart failure. You want to know right away whether this drug causes any kind of heart problems. Phase 2 will tell you that quite quickly. It'll also tell you, give you a signal for efficacy. So you can start a dosing titration schedule and pretty quickly find out where, a therapeutic range might be. It provides information on tolerability, which is always important. And then the final and most expensive phase of clinical trials are efficacy trials. And these are very, very difficult to do. They're very expensive. They're difficult to do well. They fail all the time, even though they shouldn't fail because of clinical trial design. So I see phase 3 trials, efficacy trials, as one of the biggest hurdles in moving medicines forward to become approved products. At that point, the drug generally becomes available to the patients. And after that, we have phase 4 or pharmacovigilance programs. And this is when the drug is available for prescription, and hundreds of thousands of patients around the world use it over the next 5 to 10 years. And you really find out if there are any dangers to the drug. This is how the story of fen-phen was discovered. So fen-phen was a weight loss drug that seemingly was a really effective, safe weight loss drug. Once it got approved and out into the general public, we started hearing reports of heart failure and patient deaths due to heart failure. And they discovered that fen-phen actually in 1 in 10,000 patients caused this kind of heart failure. So that's what happens in pharmacovigilance studies. But now if we go back to the two categories I was defining, and we accept that the level of evidence required may be different for the two categories, I would argue that we need at least phase 2 data for therapeutic use. So we need to understand what a safe dose is, we need to understand what the titration schedule is, and this is all to give doctors and patients the level of comfort they need to prescribe the medicine. For the clinical pharmaceutical conditions I listed, we do have to go all the way to phase 3 data because that's the only way we can ensure safe treatment of patients with these really severe, life-threatening conditions. So both of these categories, again, are equally valid categories. Both fall under the context of medical cannabis use, and both require standardized products. And this is already a huge problem in our community, which is that we don't have standardized products that are safe and effective and reliable. So these products will only become available if there's regulatory oversight of these products. And they have to be contaminant-free. So remember, these are medicines going into people who are very, very sick. So they can't contain heavy metals, pesticide residues, solvent residues, mold, or microorganisms that might make people even sicker. They have to be reproducible and have a consistent cannabinoid composition. So every time a patient takes a product, they know exactly what they're getting and they know what to expect from that product. And it ensures accurate dosing. It's the only way to ensure accurate dosing. And then, of course, we need a reliable source, so a dependable supply for patients. So if a patient finds something that actually works for pain, that patient should have the right to go back time and time again and find that same product available to him. So I think it's really, really important that regulators accept the role of ensuring all medical cannabis products meet certain standards of production. And these can be easily adapted from the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. This is a coalition of governments, including the EMA, the FDA, Japan, Canada, who all got together and decided on what the standards would be that govern pharmaceutical product production. Medical cannabis use really encompasses this huge topic, and I hope I've given you a little bit of an idea of how wide the topic is. But it's whole flower, it's whole plant extracts, it's purified extracts. So we need to start defining the doses that people are using in order to call it a medicine. Policy changes have to be put in place, especially in the US and in emerging nations. They should be put in place right away, both to govern access and to regulate the production. So the goal is to provide patients with the highest level of care. That's always been our goal. And informed, intelligent policy must remove governmental restrictions on the patient-physician relationship. And I think many governments are working towards doing this by rescheduling marijuana from, the category that says it has no medical use to a lesser category that would allow prescriptions. We have to allow for access for therapeutic purposes now without calling for more research right away. That doesn't mean that the research doesn't need to be done for the therapeutic category. We still have a long way to go in generating data that will inform treatment. But in the meantime, I don't think it's fair to ask patients to stop using cannabis right now who are really suffering and benefiting from it. And then, of course, we have to incentivize research to inform clinical treatment and the development of indication-specific medicines that are derived from cannabis. And this is for all those diseases I mentioned where cannabis could actually not only affect the symptom, the disease-related symptom, but possibly also the outcome of the disease. Thanks.